Good morning, everyone. I will now call to order the March 22, 2023 Clackamas County Board of Commissioners Land Use Hearing. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning, everyone. We are holding this meeting in person and virtually. If you are on the Zoom link and need instructions, they are at clackamas.us/meetings/BCC/land use. Today, we will consider an application by the Canby School District identified as file Z0542-22-Z to remove the historic zoning overlay on a property located at 14412 South Caras Road. Public testimony will be taken this morning. As always, the public is welcome to sign up to testify. Those wishing to testify this morning will be called on to provide your testimony at the appropriate time. When you are called on, be sure to include your name and area where you live. I would like to remind all participants, including staff, all elected officials, and members of the public, that Robert's Rules of Order will be enforced in this meeting. We welcome your opinions and look forward to your polite participation. The hearing this morning will proceed as follows. 1, we will first hear from a presentation from Senior Planter Joy Fields. Next, I will open the hearing for testimony, beginning with the applicant who may present if they wish. 3, then any public officials who wish to testify will have 3 minutes each. 4, next, representatives from recognized planning community organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes each. 5, finally, others wishing to testify will have 3 minutes each. 6, the board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set a time to make a decision at a later date. Assisting us today in the hearing room is Clerk Tony Mayernick, Planner Joy Fields, and next to her is Assistant County Counsel Nate Boderman. We will now begin the hearing on Z0542-22-Z with a legal statement by Nate Boderman, followed by the planning staff's recommendation of their report and recommendation. Nate Boderman, you're up.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Now's the time that's set for the public hearing for the previously identified historic landmark zone change application. This is a quasi-judicial land use decision, and so for those wishing to participate today, I'll flag 2 important things that you should be aware of. First, all the criteria that can be used in reaching a decision have been identified in the staff report. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the criteria identified in the staff report or other relevant criteria that the person believes applies to this decision. Accordingly, anyone testifying is asked to please direct your testimony to a relevant approval criterion. And second, failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker an opportunity to respond may preclude appeal on that particular issue to the Land Use Board of Appeals. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Once final, these decisions may be appealed to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. So at this time, I'll ask the Board of County Commissioners to disclose any ex parte contacts, bias, or conflicts of interest that you might have related to this particular application.
I have had none. Commissioners, have anybody had any ex parte comment regarding this decision?
No.
Okay. Seeing none for the record, if anyone wishes to challenge the impartiality of any commissioner, please clearly indicate your intention to do so in any written or oral testimony that you may provide. So that concludes my comments. Unless there's any questions, I'll turn it over to Joy Fields for the staff presentation.
Welcome, Joy.
Thank you for having me. As mentioned, we are here to consider Z0542-22, and it is a proposal to remove the historic landmark overlay zone from a piece of property that has had a historic structure located on it. In the staff report and in the PowerPoint before you, you see that the school district is under contract to have the historic structure moved from the property. That is irrelevant to your discussion, but I did want to provide you with an update that I learned this morning that the contract has fallen through. And so Plan B, the community members are activating Plan B and will be working with the school district to move the white building to a new location. The removal of the white building was previously approved through appropriate land use applications, including Z0523-22. And so the white building is not under consideration for this file. What is under consideration today is the historic landmark overlay zone that is a zoning overlay. The zoning overlay only covers a portion of the subject property. It covers less than an acre, specifically 0.78 acres. And that was identified in the original land use application that designated the historic overlay zone in the early 90s. The underlying zoning district is the Rural Residential Farm and Forest 5-acre zoning district. So if the historic landmark overlay zone is removed, the underlying zoning district will remain the same. As I mentioned, the approval to remove or demolish the structure from the property was approved through Z0523-22, and the appeal period ended in January with no appeals. And the Historic Review Board and staff ultimately determined that the historic structure could be removed with a 60-day suspension period of demolition to ensure that all options for moving were considered. Under our zoning code, the section that applies to historic landmarks, there is a subsection 707.02 that identifies that to have the landmark overlay district apply to a property, a site or structure must receive a minimum of 40 points under the following criteria to be considered for historic landmark status. So in the 90s, when the historic landmark overlay zone was applied to this property, there was a structure, the Karis School white building was there, and it was more than 50 years old. It had high quality of detailing and craftsmanship. It was a good example of early construction. It had little to no change from the original features, and it was one of the few remaining schools from the motor age that had such good craftsmanship. It also was conspicuous because it is on the corner of Karis Road and Highway 213, so it was a very visual landmark. And it was well located because the site was used as a school historically and continue to be used as a school. All of these items that I'm addressing qualify for the points and the evaluation criteria, which is why I'm going through them in detail here. The historic structures was standalone in the 90s. There were no environmental features, no special gardens, no special trees, no special walls or walkways that were included in the historic landmark designation. Certain historic sites have these environmental features that add to the significance of a site. This particular one, the significance was the structure. The historical significance, because it was historically used as a school and continued to be used as a school, it also had that historical significance when it was initially designated as a historic landmark. Now, when the building is moved or demolished, which again has received land use approval, the resource will no longer have the qualities that it was originally recognized for. It will no longer have the architectural significance. It will no longer have the visual significance of the historic structure being there. And so the Oregon Administrative Rules says we can consider removing that protective overlay zone and the historic landmark designation, because it will no longer have the qualities that originally designated it as a historic structure or a historic landmark. Additionally, our comprehensive plan also has a goal that addresses historic landmarks when it is determined significant by evaluation criteria. Staff went through the criteria knowing that the structure is no longer there or will no longer be there later this year, and found that there were not enough significant features to qualify for a historic landmark overlay zone if it was to be applied for today. And so the zone change criteria in 1202.03 is another section of our code that talks about zone changes. And we have followed the applicable application, and staff have found that the proposed zone change is consistent with the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. One of the items that has to be considered when you do a zone change is the transportation system adequacy. And with the removal of the historic landmark overlay zone, there is no anticipation to increase the number of schools or the number of students on the site. The goal that has been shared by the Canby School District is that following the removal of the historic structure and the landmark overlay zone, they plan to do ADA improvements and traffic improvements. But they are not anticipating an expansion of the school building, and thus there is not anticipated to be any impact on the transportation system. The Historic Review Board considered this at their March meeting and recommended approval of the removal of the zone change. And staff is also recommending approval of the removal of the historic landmark overlay zone from this property. Do you have any questions for me?
Thank you for that presentation. Commissioner Schrader, you're up.
Yeah, so let me understand this. So because the building's going to be moved, it loses its historic significance, because part of the historic significance is the site, not just the architectural
Correct.
piece and the history of it being a schoolhouse.
Correct. And staff looked at the site and the historical significance. And once the building is moved, there is not enough attributes on the site, not enough environmental significance to score it more than 40 points.
Right, it's the building on the
Exactly.
land that gives
Exactly.
it that. Tell me a little more about who's moving it, where are they moving it? So there is a community effort
There is
to-
an active community effort to move it to a new location. The Beaver Creek Hamlet has been working with the community and has met with me and representatives from the community to identify the process to move it to a new location. And so they are actively working to move it to a new location. They have a few in mind that property owners have identified, yes, we would be willing to have a community facility or a historic landmark on our property.
Okay, can it get historic landmark status after it's moved?
Potentially. It may not have some of the attributes, but it would have most likely it would have the architectural significance. And so just like the initial historic landmark overlay zone designation, we would have to score it and see if in the new location, if it would score high enough to have the historic landmark overlay zone applied to that location. And if so, it would come before you again in its new location for any application of a historic landmark overlay zone.
So in terms of why is the school district moving it? It looks like a perfectly sound building to me. I'm kind of curious as to, is it just because they have to do transportation?
They have
Improvements?
not used the structure for several years. If I remember correctly, they haven't used it since about 2008 because of ADA concerns and seismic concerns. And they had a school bond that was approved by voters to do transportation improvements and improvements on the site. And they because the building is not functional for their purposes, they are requesting that it be moved or demolished.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Scholl, you're up.
Joy, if the board approves this this morning, will there be any liability or responsibility for Clackamas County after the building's moved for site cleanup, foundation removal, or any other kind of responsibility to this county?
No,
Okay.
there would not.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner West.
Am I correct in understanding that it looks like a large portion of the historical overlay is now over a school built in the 70s?
Yes.
That isn't historical at all? So most less than an acre piece of property is not historical at all anyways? Is that correct? Well, if you have like a giant structure sitting on top of it that's from the 70s that was built after, and there's like a little bit with a little white house on it.
The school that is currently being used as a school received conditional use approval in 1974, and it did overlap the historic landmark overlay district that was measured a certain distance along Karis Road and Highway 213 in the 90s. And so you're right that the current school has a portion of it in the historic landmark overlay zone, even though it is not a historic structure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioners. I will now open public testimony on this item, beginning with the applicant. Is there anybody representing the applicant who would wish to testify on this? Tony? If so, you will have 15 minutes.
Shana Rayberg is the representative for the applicant.
Yes, thank you, Chair and County Commission. I am Shana Rehberg. I work with a company called MIG APG. Our address is 506 Southwest 6th Avenue in Portland, 97204. And it is my honor to be here on behalf of Canby School District. Denise Lapp from the school district is also in the audience, the virtual audience, if you will. And I just wanted to thank Joy and thank staff for their presentation, and to just say briefly that we concur with staff and appreciate their presentation. So I won't really add that much more to it. And I feel like your questions just now were very astute. I will just reiterate for the record that, as you now know, the White Building or Care School has been approved for removal. That we have been found to meet applicable zone change and other county code criteria, and that we kindly request your approval for the removal of this historic landmark overlay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for appearing today. Are there any public officials who wish to testify? If so, you have 3 minutes.
Chair Smith, I do not have any identified in the Zoom audience.
Thank you, Tony. Are there any representatives from any CPOs or agencies or hamlets that wish to testify? You have 3 minutes.
I also do not have any hands raised in the Zoom audience.
Okay. I will now close the public portion of this for public testimony.
Chair Smith,
Yes.
apologies. Testimony from members of the public.
From who?
Members of the public.
Members of the public, excuse me. Tony, is there anybody from the public who wishes to testify?
If there is anyone who would like to testify on this land use hearing, please use the raise hand feature, and I will call on you in the order identified. Chair Smith, I do not have any hands raised.
Okay, now I will close the public portion of this hearing, and we will move on. Commissioners, are there any questions or comments you would like to make at this time? Commissioner Schrader.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm a little worried about the trends I'm seeing here because I had been involved with a very robust historic preservation effort in this county and had worked very closely with Pam Hayden, who was a planner at the time. And at the time, it was a Goal 5 analysis where we went throughout the county and we looked at all the historic structures and not only looked at whether or not they were, possible for a state, for a national historic preservation structure, which is what we did, but also the fact that it also had a Clackamas County significant structure. And I'm worried that I'm seeing a lot of these buildings kind of still going by the wayside. And I'm worried that we seem to have a historic preservation board that it concerns me that under their, I don't want to be hypercritical, but under their umbrella, we seem to be losing historic buildings. This makes sense, but I think I'm just not going to get there just because I'm more and more concerned about what's happening with these buildings. My hope is that this building gets moved and that the Beaver Creek folks can help to continue to have it do a preservation of the building, and that eventually they can apply for another historic, designation for it, because it really is a piece of the history of our Clackamas County community. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Commissioner Schrader, on that. I concur with your sentiments on that.
Yeah.
I'm a big history buff. I bought a 1900s building in Omaha, Oregon, and converted it to a bed and breakfast inn, and we had all kinds of wonderful uses there. Unfortunately, it's becoming economically more and more difficult to preserve these buildings. I do appreciate efforts of those who honor history, who want to try to preserve this. But this particular piece of property is owned by the Canby School District. And the only action that we're taking today is to remove the historic overlay district. It is then up to them to find a home for this old school that I drive by almost once a day, right? And I look at it, I thought, is it in use yet? Is it in use yet? And it looks really out of place, because they've taken this Kara school and they have remodeled it, and it's very modern looking, and then there's this, and it's kind of frozen in time. But I guess that's what history is. Okay, Commissioners, seeing no further comment before this board, I will entertain a motion.
I move we approve Z0542-22-Z as recommended by staff and the county's Historic Review Board.
I'll second.
Commissioner Scholl has moved we approve Z 0524-22-Z as recommended by staff and the county's Historic Review Board, and it has been seconded by Commissioner West. Any further discussion? Hearing none. Tony, please take the poll.
Commissioner Scholl,
Aye.
Commissioner West,
Aye.
Commissioner Schrader,
No.
Chair Smith.
Aye, motion passes 3-1. Thank you, staff, for coming forward. I will now gavel out of this meeting